There is a passport in the Smithsonian Institution that was issued in 1910. It's a single sheet of paper, folded once, with a handwritten description of the bearer and no photograph. The stamp at the bottom says this document is valid for 2 years and requests that foreign authorities allow the bearer to pass freely without delay or hindrance. But here's what makes it remarkable. It was optional. No law required an American to carry it. You could travel to Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, anywhere on Earth. And this piece of paper was nothing more than a convenience, a letter of introduction in case you ran into trouble. The borders were open, not because of treaties or trade agreements, because the concept of requiring papers to cross them didn't exist yet. An American born in 1905 who lived to 85 would have died in 1990. That person spent the first 13 years of their life in a world where you could board a ship to Europe with nothing but a ticket. They lived through the moment. Passports became mandatory. The moment driver's licenses became identification. The moment you needed a social security number to work. The moment airports started checking ID. The moment you couldn't open a bank account without proving who you were. They watched borders go from invisible lines to militarized checkpoints. And sometime in the late 1980s, they became the last living Americans who remembered what travel felt like when the government didn't track your movements. Their children don't remember, their grandchildren can't imagine it. And the history books barely mention that it was different. I keep thinking about those Americans who died in the 1990s, the last generation who experienced both worlds. What did they make of it? Did they notice the shift? Or did it happen so gradually that each new requirement felt reasonable in the moment? Did they tell their families what it used to be like? Or did they assume everyone knew? Because we don't know. We've inherited a system where showing identification is so normal, so universal, so embedded in every aspect of life that questioning it feels absurd. But it wasn't always this way. And the transition from a world without ID to a world where you can't function without it happened within a single lifetime. I wanted to know how. I wanted to know when. And what I found wasn't a single law or a single decision. It was a ratchet. Every crisis, every war, every security scare added a new requirement. And not one of them was ever rolled back. In 1895, Mark Twain traveled around the world. He visited India, Australia, South Africa, England, dozens of countries over the course of a year. He wrote about the trip in a book called Following the Equator. And nowhere in that book, nowhere in his letters or journals, does he mention passports, visas, border inspections, or paperwork of any kind. Because there were not any. He bought tickets. He boarded ships. He disembarked in foreign ports. That was it. The idea that a government would demand to see papers proving your identity before allowing you to leave or enter a country was not part of the world he lived in. This was not because record-keeping did not exist. Ship manifests listed passengers. Hotels kept registries. Governments knew who was coming and going. But the concept of requiring individual authorization to cross a border, the idea that freedom of movement was something governments granted or denied, did not exist in practice for most of the 1800s. If you had the money for a ticket, you could go. The ticket was your documentation. The shipping company verified you could pay. That was the extent of the system. Between 1815 and 1914, an estimated 55 to 60 million people migrated from Europe to the Americas. Entire populations relocated across oceans. Families moved from Ireland to New York, Italy to Argentina, Poland to Canada. They boarded ships with whatever they could carry. Most had no paperwork beyond the ticket. Some couldn't read or write their own names. They arrived at ports, walked off the ships, and became residents of a new country. Ellis Island processed 12 million immigrants between 1892 and 1954. And the entire intake process took hours, not months. No background checks, no visa applications, no biometric scanning. A doctor looked for disease. An inspector asked your name and where you were going. You were in. Americans leaving the country faced even less scrutiny. There was no exit control. You didn't ask permission to leave. You didn't notify the government. You bought a ticket and went. The idea that a citizen needed authorization to exit their own country would have been considered tyranny. That was what autocracies did. Russia required internal passports. The Ottoman Empire restricted movement. But democracies, free countries. You were free to leave. The US State Department did issue passports starting in 1792, but they were optional and rarely used. Fewer than 200,000 were issued between 1810 and 1910, a century. 200,000 documents. For a country of 90 million people. Passports were for diplomats, for businessmen who wanted a formal introduction to foreign officials, for travelers who thought it might be useful to have a document from their government. But you didn't need one. I've seen letters from Americans abroad in the 1880s asking US consulates for emergency passports, not because they couldn't travel without them, but because they'd lost their luggage and wanted something official-looking to smooth interactions with hotels and banks. Then August of 1914 happened. World War I starts. And within weeks, European governments begin requiring passports for the first time in modern history. Not because they wanted to track their own citizens, because they wanted to control the movement of enemy nationals and prevent spies. Britain passed emergency regulations. France followed. Germany implemented checkpoints. The entire system of borderless travel across Europe, which had existed for a century, ended in a matter of months. And it was supposed to be temporary, a wartime measure. When the war ends, the controls would be lifted. That's what every government said. The United States watched this happen and stayed out of it until 1917. When America entered the war, Congress faced pressure to implement similar controls. And on May 22, 1918, President Wilson signed the Passport Act into law. For the first time in American history, it became illegal to leave or enter the United States without a passport. The law was explicit. During wartime, the president could require passports for citizens departing or entering the country. It was framed as a temporary security measure. The war would end, the requirement would be lifted, and things would return to normal. The war ended November 11, 1918. The passport requirement did not end. In 1919, the State Department kept issuing passports and enforcing the requirement. In 1921, Congress made it permanent. No debate, no sunset clause. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 embedded passport requirements into immigration law, and the travel restrictions that were supposed to last for the duration of the war became the foundation of the system we live under now. Americans who had traveled freely before 1918 found themselves needing government permission to leave the country. And there was no going back. But here's what most people don't realize. Even after passports became mandatory for international travel, domestic travel still required no identification whatsoever. You could cross state lines, fly on commercial airlines, stay in hotel, all without ever proving who you were. For most of the 20th century, Americans lived in a system where international borders were controlled, but internal movement was completely free. That started changing in the 1930s, but not because of passports. 1936. Congress passes the Social Security Act. The law creates a numbering system to track workers for tax and benefit purposes. When the first Social Security cards were issued, they included a specific disclaimer printed at the bottom. For Social Security purposes, not for identification. The government was explicit. This number was not a national ID. It was not to be used to track individuals outside the Social Security system. It was a bureaucratic tool for a specific program, nothing more. That lasted about 30 years. By the 1960s, banks started asking for Social Security numbers to report interest income. Employers used them for tax withholding. State governments began requiring them for driver's licenses. The number that wasn't supposed to identify you became the primary identifier for everything. And in 1972, the Social Security Administration quietly removed the disclaimer from the cards. No law changed, no debate happened. They just stopped printing the words "not for identification," and the de facto national ID system was complete. Driver's licenses followed the same trajectory. The first state-issued driver's licenses appeared in the early 1900s, but they didn't include photographs. They were paper certificates proving you'd passed a driving test. Some states didn't even require them until the 1920s. Photos started appearing in the 1950s, but slowly, state by state. New York didn't require photo licenses until 1973. Even as late as the 1980s, some states issued non-photo licenses for people who objected on religious or privacy grounds. But by the 1990s, photo ID was universal. And the license that was supposed to prove you could drive became the primary way Americans proved their identity for everything. Domestic AIR travel followed last. In the 1970s and 80s, you could buy an airline ticket with cash, board a plane, and fly without showing any identification. Airlines didn't check. The FAA didn't require it. Security was minimal because hijacking was rare, and when it did happen, it was usually a diversion to Cuba, not a suicide attack. You walked through a metal detector, maybe they checked your bag, and you boarded. I found a 1985 Pan Am ticket receipt in an archive. Passenger name, J. Smith. No first name, no ID number, just a receipt. That was enough. September 11th, 2001. 19 hijackers board 4 planes. None of them should have been able to. But the system was so porous, so reliant on trust and minimal checking, that they walked through security at 3 different airports and took control of 4 aircraft. The response was immediate. The Aviation and Transportation Security Act passed Congress on November 19, 2001, 69 days after the attacks. It created the Transportation Security Administration and mandated government-issued photo ID for all passengers. No exceptions. And just like the Passport Act of 1918, it was framed as a response to a crisis. Temporary security measures, necessary precautions, but there's no expiration date. The TSA is still here, the ID requirement is still here, and it's expanded. The Real ID Act passed in 2005, federalized driver's license standards, and required state IDs to meet federal specifications. By 2026, you won't be able to board a domestic flight without a Real ID compliant license or a passport. A passport, the document that didn't exist for most of American history, is now required to fly from New York to California. Let me walk you through what this means in practice. If you were born in 1905 and lived to 1990, you experienced this. Before 1918, you could travel to Europe without a passport. Between 1918 and 2001, you needed a passport for international travel, but nothing for domestic. After 2001, you need government-issued photo ID to board any commercial flight. After 2026, that ID has to meet federal biometric and security standards. Each step was a response to a crisis. Each step was supposed to be temporary. None of them ended. The ratchet only turns one direction. And it's not just travel. You can't open a bank account without ID. You can't get a job without a social security number. You can't rent an apartment, buy a car, get married, access government services, or participate in the economy without multiple forms of identification that didn't exist a century ago. The infrastructure of tracking is so total, so embedded in daily life, that opting out isn't a choice. You can't function. And the generation that remembers it being different is gone. I spent 3 weeks trying to find oral histories, interviews, anything recorded from people who remembered pre-passport travel. I found almost nothing. A few memoirs from people born in the 1890s mention it in passing, but they don't dwell on it. Why would they? It wasn't remarkable at the time, it was just normal. The way you expect air to be free, they expected borders to be open. Not because of ideology, because that's how it worked. And by the time it changed, by the time it would have been worth documenting, the people who remembered were old, and no one thought to ask. There's a woman named Ruth Gruber who was born in 1911. She became a journalist and traveled extensively in the 1920s and 30s. In an interview from 2001, she mentioned that her first passport was issued in 1932 for a trip to Germany, and she described it as a novelty, something her friends thought was exotic because most Americans still didn't have one. That interview happened 69 years after she got the passport, and she was 90 years old. She died in 2016. She was one of the last who remembered. Here's what we lost. It's not just convenience, it's not just speed, it's the presumption. In the world before mandatory identification, the default was freedom. You could move unless someone had a specific reason to stop you. The burden of proof was on the state. They had to justify restricting you. Now the burden is reversed. You have to prove you're allowed to move. You have to show papers. You have to carry government-issued documents at all times. And if you don't, you can be detained, fined, or barred from travel. The default flipped. And it happened so gradually that no single generation experienced it as a sudden loss. Each change was incremental, justified by crisis, accepted as the new normal. You cannot board a domestic flight without showing ID. You cannot cross the border, even to Canada or Mexico, without a passport or enhanced license. You cannot drive without a license. You cannot work without a social security number. You cannot rent, bank, or access most services without multiple forms of identification. And all of this, every single piece of this system, was built in the last 100 years. Americans born before 1918 lived without it. Americans born after 2000 grew up so deep inside it that they can't imagine an alternative. The last Americans who remembered what borders used to mean, who remembered traveling without ID, who experienced both the before and the after, died in the 1980s and 90s. They're gone, and with them goes the living memory that it was ever different. We're left with a system we're told is necessary, inevitable, the only way a modern country can function. But it's not. It's a choice made in response to war and crises by governments that promised the controls were temporary and then made them permanent. There's a quote I found in a 1921 congressional hearing about making passport requirements permanent. A representative from Massachusetts argued against it. He said, "We are transforming the freest country on earth into a place where a man needs the government's permission to come and go. That is not American." He lost the vote. The requirement became permanent. And a century later, we don't even remember that anyone objected. The infrastructure is total now. Biometric passports, facial recognition at airports, real ID, digital tracking, every border crossing logged, every flight recorded. The system that started with a single wartime law in 1918 has become a surveillance apparatus that would have been unimaginable to the Americans who built this country. And the thing that haunts me most is how easy it was, how little resistance there was, how each step seemed reasonable in isolation, how the ratchet turned, click by click, until the door closed completely, and we forgot it was ever open. The last American who remembered is dead. The passports they didn't need are in museums. The borders they crossed freely are militarized zones. And we've inherited a system where freedom of movement is a privilege granted by the state, not a right you're born with. That transformation happened in less than 100 years, fast enough that one person could witness it, slow enough that most people never noticed. If this makes you see airports differently, if it makes you wonder what else changed so gradually we stopped noticing, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this, more systems that transformed within a single lifetime, more freedoms that became privileges so slowly that the memory of how it used to be died with the people who lived it. The ratchet only turns one direction, and the last people who remembered which way it turned are gone.